Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Psychology. So last class, we were talking about the different parts of the brain, and we were talking about the strip of cortex cortices that are at the back of the frontal lobe. That's the motor one, and then at the front of the parietal lobe. And one of them is the motor cortex, and the other one's the somatosensory cortex. And I had said, oh, and you have this image here that shows you how much of the cortex is devoted to what region, and on the sensory side and the motor side. And I said, darn, I really want to show you this homunculus thing. And I found a picture of the sensory homunculus and the motor homunculus. And this really shows you So what does this show us? It shows us, it represents the amount of somatosensory cortex or motor cortex that is devoted to these different parts of the body. And that's conveyed to you by the size of the part of the body. So you can see that lips and tongue are a really big deal for us. You can see that, that the eyes are too. He's got big googly eyes. What else can you see? And when you compare these, anything, well, I'll give you a moment to look at this. Yes, there's a comment there. Yes, so the sensory homunculus is, well, he looks pretty well hung, but motor homunculus looks like a Barbie between his legs. And that is because in the male, an erection is something they would feel. So there'd be sensory cortex devoted to that, but not motor cortex, because the erection is actually controlled by a spinal cord response. So you have some reflexes, like let's say you touch something hot and you pull your hand back, that are managed at the level of interneurons in your spine. And you're aware of it because you're consciously aware of what you're doing. But that awareness is kind of a separate pathway, and you'd have that reflex even without the awareness because it's managed at the level of your spine. Yes, and someone noticed that the hands are larger in the motor homunculus, and that means that there's more cortex devoted to moving your hands and your fingers, that fine dexterity, than there is for the feeling. So this kind of gives you a sense of what's really important to us as a species, right? It's our hands and our ability to speak and to see. There is a system of cortical hierarchy. When sensory information enters the brain, it first goes to that sense's primary sensory cortex, okay? And then it goes up to the association cortex. There's a primary visual cortex, there's a primary auditory cortex. And then there are these higher association areas. And in these higher levels, processing gets more complex. And the association cortices include most of the cerebral surface of the human brain, and they're largely responsible for the complex processing that goes on between arrival of the input in the primary sensory cortices and generation of behavior. And damage to the association cortices causes damage to higher levels of human behavior. And here's an example. Let's say you're going to bake a birthday cake, and you might know how to bake a birthday cake, but you might do it on the wrong day, and maybe you do it in the wrong order. Right? What's getting messed up is not the simple motor behaviors of, putting the flour in and putting in the eggs in. It might be that you do it on the wrong day, or maybe you forget to bake it, or something like that. Next, the next structure we'll talk about are the basal ganglia. And these are structures in the forebrain that help control movement. And it's more than movement, it's also reward for moving. And the idea there is that there's some actions that we take that are intentional. So let's say I'm going to drink this coffee. And maybe that's good for me. Maybe there's some calories in there. And then I feel rewarded. And that sense of reward is about the dopaminergic system in my basal ganglia. So the idea there is that I'm gonna repeat this behavior. This intentional behavior. I'm gonna do it again. Okay. And that's what's going on with the rat that's kind of pushing the lever in the Skinner box, and it's getting rewarded with a pellet. And it's like it's going to do that again. Damage to the basal ganglia can contribute to Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a brain disorder, and that causes unintended or uncontrollable movements like shaking, stiffness, difficulty with balance or coordination. And as the disease progresses, people have difficulty walking and talking, and they can also have sort of mental and behavioral changes, sleep problems, depression is an issue, memory difficulties, and feeling fatigued. The most prominent signs and symptoms of Parkinson's disease happen when the nerve cells in the basal ganglia become impaired or die. Okay? And so these dopaminergic neurons are dying, and you have less dopamine in the system. Parkinson's disease isn't just about dopamine. They also lose nerve endings that produce norepinephrine, and norepinephrine is like your stress hormone. It's the main chemical messenger of the sympathetic nervous system, the one that gets aroused when you have to face a challenge, and that controls like many body functions, like heart rate and blood pressure. And depression as a symptom of Parkinson's disease tells you that, you know, depression isn't just low serotonin, right? There's many different ways that depression shows up, and you know, a lack of feeling rewarded for doing things could be one of them too. The main therapy for Parkinson's is levodopa, and neurons use levodopa to make dopamine to replenish the dwindling supply that's associated with that disease. Yes, and Muhammad Ali had Parkinson's, and it was suggested in your textbook that perhaps that could have been caused by getting hit in the head a lot. I see a question from Genevieve. Or raised hand. Go ahead. You're welcome to speak. Oh, okay. Apparently it was just an accident. All right. On to the midbrain and the limbic system. The limbic system is involved in emotional responses and survival behavior. And those are, you know, the 4 F's, right? Eating, reproduction, also taking care of young, and your fight-flight reactions. This emotional center of your brain has a role in smell, which is really interesting. And one of the oldest parts of your brain is the part that handles smell. And we're very visual creatures as humans. And so we forget how important and how primal smell is to other animals. And you know this if you have a dog, right? Like what do you go for a walk with a dog, and a lot of what it's doing is sniffing, right? And they sniff for food. They sniff to see what other dogs have been doing and where they've been. They sniff each other, right? They go right for the butt. They sniff you. The first thing like a dog wants to do when it meets you is like stick its nose in your crotch. And this is a really basic ability for mammals. It provides like a lot of information about important things. Like consider that a tomcat can smell a female in heat from 2 miles away. So it's not surprising that smell is connected to our primal instincts. And emotions are primitive to cognitions. Like all animals, even simpler animals that are less complex than us, that don't have language, that, you know, if they have, we don't know if they would have thought, they can't really tell us, but if they did, they'd be a much simpler. Well, they have all those basic emotions. So this part of your brain evolved around the primitive olfactory system. I think that there is a lot of potential for aromatherapy if we understand this. So some people might think about aromatherapy as in, like, you know, sniff some cinnamon oil and it will cure your diabetes, and no, it's not like that. The evidence for aromatherapy is that it can help with like anxiety and depression, and that makes sense because those are about emotions. One of the ways I like to use aromatherapy is for conditioning myself to sort of different situations. Everyone's reaction to smell is unique. So let's say that the smell of leather, right? Like, what does that mean to you? It might, if you have some traumatic association with it, it might make you feel very differently than somebody who's, I don't know, had a wonderful time with their grandfather working in the leather shop, right? You get the idea. And so some of the things I like to do are to say, I have a scent that I try to condition to my workplace. Like, I'm focusing now and I'm focusing intently. And I have another one that's like, I'm dealing with the really stressful parts of my job. And I have another one that is like, okay, now I'm leaving it behind and I'm going to go spend time with my family. And those kind of, they help me get in the right mood. So, yeah, that's an alternative therapy that I think has a lot of potential if you understand the way that smell and emotion and emotion. Sorry, side joke that somebody got attacked by a leather bear. So you might not like the smell. There's a strong association between smell and taste. If you lose your sense of smell, you're also going to lose your sense of taste. Your perception of a scent is based on so much more than the scent itself. There's a really interesting psych lab ways to do it, Dal, where you get students to sniff some scent and you ask them what it is. And it's really difficult to do that. Like when you're just sniffing it from say a brown bottle and it doesn't say, there's no label, people can't tell. And then you say, that's lavender. Like, oh, it's lavender. Yeah, of course. Or, oh, that's peach. Yeah. Okay. Then when you tell them, then they really get that that's the scent. If you showed them a picture of a peach or a picture of lavender, then they'd get it really easily. But when you strip away all those other associations, it's much harder for people to tell what the scent is. Okay, back to the limbic system. So there's the systems associated with certain structures. The thalamus is something that I imagine as like a switchboard. It relays information that comes in from the sense organs to the appropriate primary sensory cortex. Underneath that is the hypothalamus. Hypo means under, and it regulates and controls internal bodily states. I think of it as a thermostat. It if you're getting too hot or your heart rate's too high, then it would act to bring it back down. And it controls the pituitary gland, which secretes hormones. The amygdala is a really important structure. The amygdala is almond shape. That is why it's called the amygdala. And it plays a role in fear and excitement and arousal. First thing I need to mention, because I noticed there's something wrong with these slides, because I know I worked on them and I edited them and I'm not seeing my changes. So this is what I wanted to mention. You don't have one amygdala. There's one on either side. You have two amygdalae. You don't have one hippocampus. You have one on either side, right? So you have two hippocampi, but the way we talk about these structures in the textbook kind of sounds as if there was only one, right? Like when I say the amygdala, that makes you think there's only one. No, there's two. The hippocampi play a role in spatial memory. So birds have large hippocampi, and damage to that can cause an inability to form new memories. And the famous example there was a patient named HM, who after he had an operation that damaged his hippocampi, I don't know if it was one or both, he was not able to form new memories. And so he still had a short-term memory, which is the one that lasts for like a second. So, but if you went and introduced yourself to him, you could leave the room, come back in, and you'd have to introduce yourself to him all over again because he wasn't storing that memory. So the hippocampus plays a role in this, in turning short-term memory, which is kind of like the instant moment-by-moment consciousness, putting that in your long-term store. And it does a lot of memory consolidation overnight when you're sleeping, which is why it's a really good idea for you to get a good night's sleep ahead of your midterm. I think about the hippocampus as a library shelving assistant. That was one of my first ever jobs. I had this book truck and I went around, you pick up the books that people have read and left on tables, and then you push this cart around the library and you read the code on the spine and put it back in the right place. That's my metaphor for the hippocampus. Now imagine if you don't sleep before your test and you need that shelving assistant to go and take down a book for you, but it's like it's drunk. It's not going to work properly. So you have to, sometimes people stay up all night and study for a test if they're feeling anxious. And so you have to ask yourself, well, how much are you going to learn from doing that? And how is that offset by the damage you're doing to your memory by not sleeping? Because you're not going to consolidate them as well as if you were sleeping. Your hippocampus or hippocampi like to do that while you're asleep. Other structures in the limbic system. So the cingulate cortex is the primary cortical component of the limbic system, and it's involved in higher levels of processing, right, of emotional and cognitive processing. We have already talked about the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the hippocampus. Those stories, those pictures of cats, which make me sad because I like cats, are pictures of where a cat has had electrodes somehow placed so that the experimenters can push a button and activate the amygdala or amygdalae. And then the cat goes and produces one of these sort of primal responses. And in the first one, you can see that it's a rage display, but you can also see that that's an inappropriate response to a rat, right? That's an appropriate response to another cat. And in the second picture, they're able to stimulate it and get the cat to engage in this sort of biting behavior. So those are your basic primal instincts for a cat. And the amygdala has a role in producing those behaviors. So, but it doesn't just do one thing. And I keep talking about it as if there's one of them, not two about them. See how easy it is to do that? Anyway, influences our motivation, emotional control, fear response. Right? Has a lot to do with anger and fear, and also with interpretation of nonverbal emotional expression. And think that the midbrain is primitive to the forebrain, which developed later. And if you don't have language, well, how do you communicate? Maybe it involves looking at facial expressions. When a cat sort of goes, that means something. Underneath that, at the bottom of your brain, is your brainstem. That's located at the very back, and it's the area that connects the cerebral cortex, which is a higher level of your brain, and your spinal cord. And it performs really basic bodily functions. For instance, if the reticular formation is severed in a cat, goes into a coma, never wakes up. That's basic arousal. and it serves as a relay station between the cortex and the rest of the nervous system. So the brainstem consists of the cerebellum, which looks like a kind of baby brain at the back of your brain. And that has a role in coordination and in movement. So cats who can just walk along the top of a fence have a relatively large cerebellum for their body. And here you can see the spinal cord, which goes up into the medulla, and then the pons. And the pons and the medulla together form the hindbrain. The pons connects the cortex to the cerebellum and has some role in dreams. Your dreams are often negative, typically, and really bizarre, if you can remember them at all. And that has something to do with your higher level of awareness trying to make sense of what it's producing with the sensory information. Right? You try to tell a story, and it ends up being a pretty bizarre story. The medulla regulates breathing, heartbeat, and other vital functions. The reticular activating system connects the forebrain and the cerebral cortex, and has a very basic role in arousal. And I don't know why I had something there about the midbrain. Assume that that's in there by accident. Wrong section, sorry. So there's a concept of brain death, and it can mean different things, but it means that you're legally dead, and if you're a donor, then they could harvest those organs, and someone could make a decision to turn off life support. So there are different medical definitions of brain death. So one might be that it's cerebral death, right? Another one might say that it's the death of the brainstem too, or is it like the death of the whole brain? So there's a few different diagnoses, like there's brain death, there's persistent vegetative state. You're thought to not be able to recover from brain death, but to be able to recover from a persistent vegetative state. And I guess a neurologist would be involved in the determination that you couldn't recover from it. I don't love the language of vegetative state because it compares somebody to a vegetable. This picture is from a famous American case that was quite controversial. So she had one of these diagnoses, and her parents very much wanted to keep her alive, and her husband very much wanted to let her pass. And so there was a big court battle. There's several. It was heavily politicized, and in the end, I think her husband won because that's just kind of the way the law works. So he got to make that decision. All right, the spinal cord. So you know what your spine is, and there's a really important nerve or it's a thick bundle of nerves that runs down it, and it conveys signals between the body and the brain. The sensory nerves carry information up from the body to the brain, and then there are motor nerves that carry information, like instructions, from the brain to the rest of the body. It also contains those interneurons that allow reflexes to happen. Okay, so the ones that manage your pulling your hand back when you touch something hot, or the erection of the penis. Okay, those are managed by interneurons. It's interesting that the homunculus is male, and I wonder, if a female sexed homunculus would look different. No one's done that work to my awareness. The peripheral nervous system refers to nerves that extend outside the central nervous system. The central nervous system, or CNS, is your brain and spinal cord. Okay, and then the nerves that go out to the rest of your body are your peripheral nervous system. And this is divided into two branches, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And we've touched on these before. So the somatic nervous system is about that sort of intentional controlled motion that you're aware of. And it sends information from the CNS to the muscles in the body. It's about voluntary movement. And then the autonomic nervous system controls the involuntary actions of your internal organs and glands. That's why you can't just tell your heart to stop beating, okay? Because it's not under the control of your autonomic nervous system. So think autonomic, I remember it by thinking automatic. And it has two divisions. One of them is the sympathetic division, and one's the parasympathetic division. And the sympathetic division is what's aroused in your fight or flight stress response. And it was, it evolved for you to confront, saber-toothed tigers. And now we're provoking it over your midterm. And it's quite a lot of wear and tear on your body, right? To have like your heart work and your stomach doesn't feel good. You want to run to the bathroom. It's like a physiological overreaction in the modern context. So that's why it's important to have stress management skills, or like breathing, okay, and not sweating the small stuff. It's all small stuff. Okay, imagine if you had to meet a saber-toothed tiger on Wednesday. That would be so much worse. It's just a test. Once you've confronted the saber-toothed tiger and written the midterm, you'll relax. Okay, and then you might go and have a snack. And when one is activated, the other is inactive. And this is important to the stress and illness connection, because when your stress response is engaged, your body wants to send the energy to like your muscles so that you can run away or fight. And it turns down the energy that's going to your digestive system, which is why you're not hungry and you want to go to the bathroom, or sometimes you're really stressed, you might even feel like you want to throw up. And it also directs energy away from something else that's super costly and not needed in that moment that you're fighting the tiger. And that's your immune system. Okay, so that sympathetic activation also suppresses your immune system. And there is a connection between being stressed and being more susceptible to infection. But when you're calm, then your body can have more energy for your digestive system, for your immune system, for your reproductive system. On to the endocrine system. This is not the nervous system, but it's also important, and it's ultimately going to be controlled by the central nervous system, right, by the hypothalamus. It's a system of glands and hormones that controls the chemical messaging in your body. So you have these nerve impulses that are electrochemical, with your neurons firing, but then something else that your brain does is put hormones right in your bloodstream. Okay, and these affect your behavior, and they affect particular organs. And let's talk about some of the major hormones. But first, the hormones are released by glands, and called the pituitary gland, the master gland. It releases some hormones and then controls other glands in the body. And it releases hormones that influence growth, like human growth hormone, blood pressure, other functions. And one of these is oxytocin. And oxytocin ultimately makes us more sensitive to social cues. So it is called like a love hormone. So when people snuggle, then oxytocin is being released. But oxytocin I think there was a study that implicated it somehow in domestic violence, and I would see that as like possibly a partner, trying to, in their way, protect the other partner by, being really controlling. That would be my guess. So probably the fairest thing to say about it is that it makes us more sensitive to social cues. Interesting comment. The more I learn about the brain, the less I understand how this all works together as a full system. There's so much that we don't know. Like, if what we needed to know about the brain was a mile, we know about 2 inches of it. And learning those 2 inches just makes you go, wow, this is so complicated and I don't get it. It's because we don't really. Exactly. All that means is that you're on the same level as most scientists. And I think it's really important that we're aware of that, because we can get hubristic when we identify mental illnesses and disorders. If you say that something's a disorder, it means you know what order is. And I'm not sure that we know enough about the human brain to say that in many cases. Question from a student: as an autistic person that often misses out on social cues, does this mean that my brain has a different relationship with oxytocin? I do not know. I don't know about the neuroscience of autism, though I imagine it would be very interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Autism involves theory of mind, which is about understanding that other people have different minds and know and believe and perceive different things. But I don't know whether that would have anything to do with oxytocin. But it's a good question for Google Scholar. Your adrenal glands are important to your stress response, and they are located on top of your kidneys. And they release adrenaline and cortisol, which are those are some of your fight or flight hormones. And adrenaline boosts energy production in the muscle cells, and cortisol regulates blood pressure and your heart function, as well as the use of proteins and carbohydrates and fats. I have diabetes, and being stressed can just really mess up my glucose. So I've found a very big difference in my control when I have less stress in my life, surprising. Chance had a question about, is it true that we know 2 inches worth of information about the brain as compared to a mile? It's a metaphor to say there is so much we don't know, and it's so much greater than what we do know. The brain is a very, very complicated organ. And, 100 years ago, we were doing phrenology. Yeah, no, it's a metaphor. Metaphors are iffy things in science, because they can help you understand a concept, but they often don't map properly, and they're artistic and intuitive. And so maybe you'll be like, oh, I get that, or maybe you'll be like, it'll mess you up. The sexual reproductive glands are the testes in people of the male sex and the ovaries in people of the female sex. Both sexes manufacture testosterone and estrogen, but men make relatively more testosterone, and people of the female sex, I should say that instead of women, make relatively more estrogen. And that amount changes over the lifespan. And both sexes manufacture testosterone, and there's some testosterone productions from your adrenals as well that are part of that stress response. Testosterone is a very interesting hormone, and there's a sort of belief that testosterone makes people more aggressive, or animals more aggressive, and there's something to that. But like oxytocin, it's more complicated than that. There was a study where they gave both men and women shots of testosterone, and when the context they were put in was a game where they had to be socially skilled and sort of charming or nice, then they were more socially skilled. right? Not more aggressive, because being socially skilled was about how you won that game. And so testosterone is maybe more about winning than being aggressive, right? Aggression is one way to win. It's kind of maybe keep that in your back pocket, but not the only way. And the people in that study ended up using the best way according to the context they were put in. And yeah, there's a comment about intersex people and about how textbooks don't mention them. And that's absolutely true. They're very left out. I mean, consider there's this intersex athlete. I can't remember that person's name right now. It's not coming to me. Maybe a sprinter, possibly, who just can't practice her sport because there's just no category that she can compete in. So she identifies as a woman, but they're saying, no, you're not a woman, so you can't. And maybe the female competitors are mad that she's running faster than them. But it's upsetting to think that, perfectly normal human can't, compete in sports because we don't have a category for that person, that type of person. Intersex people arise in every culture and have done so, over human history. I think the rate might be something like 1%. But, if when we're designing our systems, we don't make room for that 1%, well, what happens to those folks? Yeah, a big question in psychology is it nature or is it nurture? And our nature is in our genotype, in our chromosomes. But genotype isn't the same thing as phenotype, which is about our observable traits. And that's because sometimes genes aren't expressed, right? Maybe they're recessive and they're masked by a dominant gene. Maybe it's genes not turned on. So you can have a fetus that is XY, which is genetically male, develop into a normal human female because the Y wasn't activated, right? And the patterning's all on the X. So you can have somebody that is genetically male and then be outwardly look like a B, right? A person of the female sex because the Y wasn't expressed. And life experiences can affect gene expression as well. Now, I'm sure you've all heard about the theory of evolution, and organisms have adaptations that make them better suited to their environment. I don't like that it says some. I wish I had deleted that because it's all of them. Right? So a fish has fins that are an adaptation for swimming. A giraffe has a long neck that's an adaptation for eating leaves that are high up. Right? Your memory is an adaptation that allows you to make better decisions. Right? Your consciousness is an adaptation. So if an adaptation results in better luck, right? Better survival and reproduction for the animal, then we'd say it contributes to its fitness. And there's a lot of competition out there in the world, and the fitter survive to pass along their genes and pass that trait down. So those are physical adaptations, but then there are also behavioral adaptations. And humans have cultures that tell us what behaviors are appropriate and inappropriate, because historically these behaviors have been adaptive. So aggression is an instinct, is a behavior, and it has adaptive value. You can use your aggression maladaptively by taking your fist and taking it into a wall. That's not going to do anything for your fist or the wall. Or, you could go and assert yourself and leave a situation better than it was before. So aggression is something that can, help you claim resources or, fight off somebody. Right? Your anger is a gift to yourself from yourself. It tells you what you need. Anxiety that keeps you out of trouble, right? Helps you predict danger. Sadness promotes social bonding. So if you're sort of feeling sad, the solution for most of us is to go find a friend. The feeling of pride, its adaptive value is a reward for a good performance. Now, I see some questions. First one, it would be cool to see another section of sports that are more like e-sport are organized. I don't know what e-sport is. We can still have men and women leagues, but then also mixed team leagues. Yeah. And there's another question. You mentioned how ADD is a societal construct because it would be a behavioral adaptation in another setting. All mental illnesses, all of them are socially constructed because there's a big book of mental illnesses that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and a bunch of people got together and agreed on those definitions and their labels. Okay? So any disorder is socially constructed to be a disorder, and there may be another setting where that's not seen as a disorder. And then they also all have a biological basis. If I move my hand, something happened in my brain. Okay. Let's take schizophrenia. That is seen as a mental illness here in modern society, one that's highly treatable. But schizophrenia comes up in all cultures, and it's been dealt with very differently in other cultures and other time periods. So think about the oracles in ancient Greece. They have these visions. They seem to speak in tongues, and the oracles were some of the most powerful people, like women in the ancient world. Like you wouldn't do anything without going to consult the oracle. So they didn't say that the oracles were mentally ill, but they had the same kind of behavior of having these disordered thoughts and speaking in word salad and having visions. But they saw that as, they had as a religious thing. And apparently the oracles used some fumes. Like I think there was an oracle that was located where there was was it smoke coming out of some old volcano? Like there was probably some toxicity involved there. But historically, a lot of religious figures have what a textbook of mental illness would describe as delusional disorder. Okay, so these behaviors, they're the same behaviors. They're socially constructed differently in different times. And yeah, I see a comment that that playing games is about skill level and physical ability, and that's affected by gender because there's different biology. Yeah. I'm reading another comment. Slightly back to the topic of intersex individuals, the current statistics of how common being intersexed is 1.7% of the population. So I thought it was 1.7 is a lot higher than that. It's almost twice as much. For context, being a redhead is 2% of the population. So being intersex is only slightly less common. And so, yeah, there are millions of people across the world who are intersex. And does society make a place for that very real 2%? And some societies do a better job of that than others. All right, the evolution of the brain, our fancy brains. So humans and apes last shared a common ancestor 6 or 7 million years ago. And then something happened, and we don't know what it was that just allowed us to develop these brains that are so much more complex than other animals. And right, like they've tripled in size compared to our closest ape cousins. There is a connection between relative brain size and more higher cognitive ability. I don't like the use of the term intelligent there, because intelligent really just means making decisions that are adaptive, right? A fruit fly is intelligent if it can find the banana, but what they mean there is higher levels of cognitive ability. And humans have the largest brain size relative to their body. There's a field of behavioral genetics that studies the relative impact of nature and nurture on psychological traits. So let's take schizophrenia. How heritable is that? That's something that we can study. Heritability is a population level measure, and it refers to the percentage of variability in a trait across individuals that is due to genes versus to environment. And let's say we say that schizophrenia is 50% heritable. That doesn't mean an individual, that's not an individual level measure, right? It doesn't mean that 50% of that came from their parents and 50% of it came from the environment. That's not what it means. It means in the entire population, and remember, we're inferring about the entire population from a sample, it means that refers to the percentage of variability in that trait in the population that's due to genetic factors. And some traits are more heritable than others. So height is very heritable, but religion isn't. Personality is sort of somewhat heritable. I think the score is around like 40%. Interests are also heritable. Studies with limited range on environment can overstate heritability, because if you studied some phenomenon in a context where the environment was the same for everyone, and just think of it, that's the context in a lot of adoption studies, because children are only adopted into very particular environments that are approved by the authorities, the state authorities, then you can overstate heritability. So if you had complete control over the environment, then 100% of the variance would have to come from genetics. So to do these studies well, you want to include a range of environments, but that's often not possible. Okay. What kind of research designs do we use? So if we want to see how a trait runs in a family, we could do a family study. And we would say, okay, the child has this trait. Do the parents have it? Does the grandparents have it? Does it run through the male line or the female line? And the issue there is that we could be muddling up genetics and environments, because everyone in that family is pretty much living in a shared environment. And so the way that we try to that researchers try to disentangle this is through like twin studies and adoption studies. So what they like to compare rates of a trait in identical twins that were like raised together versus identical twins that were raised apart. And then you could compare that to fraternal twins who were raised together or raised apart. And those designs can help determine what the contribution is of genes and environment. Okay, I'm gonna talk about the midterm, and then while I was speaking, I saw that quite a few comments go by. I'll read those later, but I'm gonna use the last couple of minutes to talk about the midterm, because that is what we're gonna be doing next class. So the midterm is on Moodle. Okay, go to the page of Moodle, don't come here, and go and open your midterm there. It is set to open at 9:30 a.m. So you have to refresh the page. Okay, your page doesn't auto refresh. You have to push the F5 button. So if you won't see it when you sign in at 9:29, because it's not released until 9:30. So at 9:30, hit refresh on your page, and it should come up. There is one matching question with 10 sort of subparts, and then 40 multiple choice questions. It is auto-graded. It's open book. Look at your textbook, look at your notes, but do not share or talk to other students. Last year's average grade was 64%. I took that exam and I removed the short answer questions. They don't have the capacity to grade 220 short answer responses, and I replaced them with auto-graded questions. I will be here in the virtual classroom. I'll probably have this slide posted so that if you need me, I'm here, but I hope that you won't. And then I'm planning to stay here until noon, and you're very welcome to check out, check in with me on the way out. How did that go for you? Are there any questions about the lecture today or about the midterm? Yes, Alyssa.
Yeah, so just to confirm, the midterm is only on the first 2 chapters, right? And not on this material?
Yes, and that's in the syllabus. So
okay, perfect.
It says in the syllabus the midterm 1 is on chapters 1 and 2, midterm 2 is on chapters 3 and 4, and final exam, which is non-cumulative, will be on the remaining chapters that we read.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. It is a 50-minute exam, and there are some folks who have accommodations for extra time, and if that's been arranged through the Megan Center, then those folks get extra time. There's a question, is there any other practice questions we could do? No, so that's the, I posted something that was from the previous instructor that was about showing you what some questions look like. So it's very short, and you can see what a multiple choice question looks like. You can see what a matching question looks like. So go take a look at that, but it's not really a practice test. The only way you could do practice tests is in Revell in your textbook, but that needs to be set up on my end. And a student asked me to do that, and I contacted the textbook publisher, and they haven't gotten back to me, and I can't do it without their help. So unfortunately, no, there are not any practice tests. I'm going to stop the recording here, and I'll read through the chat.
Have a wonderful day.